Hello again, everybody. Welcome once again to another episode of the Tigers Baseball Podcast. Barring a minor miracle, only 2 more to go until the end of the season. This one, and of course next week, when we will wrap things up. I might actually wait on next week's pod to see if they have a state of the team address, like a press conference like they did back in 2021 when Chris Ilitch lied to all of us and said that there were all the resources available at Alavila's disposal so he could go out and get Javi Baez. When you had the likes of Carlos Correa and Dansby Swanson and I can't remember who else was in that shortstop class, but still the point remains, we ended up with Javi Baez. So there you go. So I might see about that. I'm just trying to decide what I want to do. Of course, if things go the way we hope, then we will be talking about a playoff run next week. And we'll have to actually do a pod on Sunday because there'll be playoffs coming up. But that is a long way away. That is a road that has not been traveled for the Tigers since 2014. So we can always hope. But anyway, all that being said, let's have the injury report real quick. Wenceel Perez was reinstated earlier this week. Ryan Kreidler sent down to the minors. That move does not necessarily make sense to me because you basically now have, well, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 outfielders and 7 infielders. Well, 5 infielders. 6 technically, because Matt Vierling can play third base. You really don't need Justin Henry Malloy up here when Wenceel Perez is up here because Wenceel's a switch hitter. So if you want to get a little bit of power in the late in the game and with Wenceel's speed, it just didn't make any sense to me. But you know what? AJ Hinch is the one that's making the money. I'm not. Scott Harris is the one that's making the money. I'm not. If they think Jeff Greenberg's the one making the money, I'm not. If they think that it was better to send Kreidler back down, then it was better to send Kreidler back down. That's what they feel, and so I'm just going to let them have their moment in the sun. So, all that being said, Wenceel Perez is back. Reese Olson will be back probably on Tuesday. He's with the team. He just hasn't been activated yet. That will probably be on Tuesday, so he can start against Kansas City. Of course, Casey Mize is going tomorrow for Detroit. At least that's the preliminary, the way the rotation shakes out right now. Although you could move him back a day and get Reese Olson in tomorrow night. You could piggyback Reese Olson and Casey Mize. There's any number of ways you could do it. There's any number of things you can do if you're AJ Hinch. I don't really know. I don't really want to try to speculate on what he's going to do, what he's going to come up with, but suffice it to say, he's got work to do between now and then to figure out what the right mix is going to be and what the right, and he has said as much. He said, look, this is going to be the challenge, is figuring out what the right mix is, what the right way to handle the situation is going to be. That's our greatest challenge right now. And, you know, he's happy to face it. So, so those are the 2 big updates. Javi Baez was actually posing for a team picture last week, and he was using a walking stick to help him get onto the field for that team picture. So, that's really his progress, and not much more there. So let's get into the nitty gritty of this. I made the comment last week that Detroit had to go 4-2 on this homestand, preferably 5-1. They were within. Well, they were tied at 2 in the top of the ninth against Colorado, and Colorado scored 2 on Thursday to at least salvage a game from that series. Detroit took 2 out of 3 from Colorado, and then they came in and took 2 out of 3 from Baltimore. So they went 4-2 on the homestand. That's got them 2.5 games back of Minnesota. 12 games for Detroit, 13 games for Minnesota. And here's what we've got to look forward to over the next 2 weeks. Mind you, the season ends on Sunday, September 29th. All games start at 3 p.m. Eastern that day. That's one of the rules that Major League Baseball has implemented, and I think it's a great rule. It keeps teams on the East Coast, if they're teams on the West Coast, I should say, if they have a pennant race and there's teams that are involved in that pennant race and they're playing on the East Coast, the West Coast teams that are at home, if they're leading their division, they don't have to play their players on that last day, if they've already clinched because of what happened on the East Coast. So basically they're saying, you know what, we're gonna dash the time difference. It's a noon start in LA, it's a 3:00 start in New York. So that's what it's gonna be, and everybody else can sort themselves out. And as I said, I agree with this. I like this. They took a page out of the Premier League's book, because they do that on the last day of the season as well. Every game starts at 3:00, I think, for that same reason. Now, if you have a game, if you've already clinched your spot in the playoffs, if you've already clinched your division or clinched a wild card berth, and you already know where you're going to be seated, sure, go ahead and rest your players. And what smart manager wouldn't do that? But this just adds a little bit to the process. So there is that. Anyway, onward. So, and I shouldn't say next week's podcast. The podcast on the 29th may be done on the 29th. It may be done later, depending on if there's what the playoff situation looks like with Detroit. What the playoff situation looks like with Detroit right now is they're 2.5 games back of Minnesota. Minnesota starts 4 in Cleveland tomorrow. Then they got 3 against Boston. Then 3 against Miami and 3 against Baltimore. Detroit has 3 starting tomorrow night in Kansas City, 3 in Baltimore, and then they're finished the season with 6 straight at home. Tampa and Chicago, and I believe both teams are playing the same days next week. So it's not Minnesota Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Detroit Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or vice versa. It's both teams on all 3 days. We know they'll both be playing Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The question is what will the playoff situation look like at that point? I honestly, this week is critical for both teams. This week is critical because if Minnesota goes into Cleveland and loses 3 out of 4 to Cleveland, and Detroit can win 2 out of 3 for from Kansas City, then you got a team that's a game back. Detroit's a game back out of Friday. And then Boston and Baltimore are I mean, Boston will probably be out of the wild card chase by that point. If they aren't, it doesn't matter because Detroit holds the tiebreaker over Boston. The only team that in the wild card race right now that Detroit doesn't hold the tiebreaker over is Minnesota. They're 6-7 against Minnesota. They went 4-3 against Boston. Tampa is still in the wild card race, but they've got head-to-heads with Detroit next week. They're 2-1 right now against Tampa. So they only need to win 2 more games against Tampa, and they'll have the tiebreaker over them. They're 5-1 against Seattle. So they've got the tiebreakers over those 3 teams. Well, 2 of the 3 teams. And of course, they've got Tampa next week. Now, Tampa's not necessarily in the wild card race, but they're in the wild card race. So if that makes any sense, it probably doesn't, but that's okay. So really what it boils down to is if Detroit can hold their own, Detroit needs to go, look, I would like to see Detroit go 3-3, but that would mean that they would have to sweep. Well, they'd have to take 1 series at least. And I don't like their odds trying to take a series in Kansas City. They're 0-3 in Kansas City this year. They went into Kansas City and got swept earlier on this year. That was the game where Reese Olson got hit by the comebacker, and Tarek Skubal absolutely just fell apart. So I don't like their odds of taking 2 out of 3 in Kansas City. And look, you took 2 out of 3 from Baltimore at home, but that's at home. Camden Yards is going to be different, especially when it's playoff time. Baltimore is fighting with the Yankees for a division title, as well as the wild card spot. So that's a tough row to hoe. Your best bet is 2-4. 3-3 would be amazing. 2-4 is your best bet. Then you got to win all 6 next week. You've got to sweep Tampa. You got to sweep Chicago. You do that. First of all, you're at 85 wins. Secondly, I don't think Minnesota has the ability to take 3 out of 4 from Cleveland. I don't think Minnesota has the ability to sweep Boston. And I don't think that next weekend Minnesota is going to do well against Baltimore because, again, Baltimore has a division title to play for still. Minnesota doesn't. Minnesota's just trying to hold on to that last wild card spot. And if they don't do well in Cleveland this week, they're out of that divisional race by a long shot. Now, if Detroit can take 2 out of 3 from Kansas City, Cleveland will be very happy, especially if they take 3 out of 4 from Minnesota. But that's a whole nother story. That's a whole nother kettle of fish, as they say. So the brilliant thing about this week is we will know before the Kansas City games end what our fate is with Minnesota, because those Minnesota games are in Cleveland. They're an hour ahead of Kansas City. So they will finish earlier. And so the Tigers will actually know what's going on during their game. They'll know what they have to do. Of course, AJ Hinch will just tell you, go out and win every day and you'll be fine, which he's right. But, we'll see. Of course, then Baltimore is in the Eastern time zone. And then Minnesota has the same advantage Detroit had next week, because Detroit is, of course, an hour ahead of Minneapolis. So, and I do think it's kind of ironic, and I'm just the geek that would think about this. I do think it's kind of ironic that there's a wild card race involving Minnesota and Detroit, and both teams are playing the Florida teams at the exact same time next week, and there's wild card implications involving both teams Of course, Miami is not in the wild card race, and Tampa is still on the outside looking in. But anyway, so with that, I am going to sign out and call it a night. I really appreciate you listening. Like, rate, and subscribe, all of that fun stuff. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, do what you have to do. Catch us on Twitter at Podcast Tigers, or sorry, at TB Podcast. No, at Podcast Tigers, that's right. Mastodon is at TB Podcast at Mastodon. Bleh. Mastodon is at TB Podcast at tweezcake.social. And you can catch us via email, tigersbaseballpodcast@gmail.com. It's the longest email address in the world, and I'm proud of that. We will catch you next week, ladies and gentlemen. Until then, go Tigers.